Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
I would like to announce just before we start the session that these sessions will allow our speakers that come later and myself, we're going to be speaking Spanish. So if any of you need translation, can take the audios, like the headphones that are right there. You can just raise your hand and they will pass them to you. So, si todos estamos bien, entonces, con respeto.
So if we're all okay then with these interpretation and language-related matters, let's get started. Very good afternoon to everyone. Everyone who's with us here, face-to-face. Finally, we're seeing people's faces again. And also to everyone who's on streaming. And those who are going to see us afterward, because the session is being recorded. So welcome to talk this afternoon about the coming decade for higher education in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the session is being jointly organized by 5 different organizations, but with a broad trajectory, a long trajectory, of 30, 40, even 50 years in this field. And the idea being access to higher education in the region. We have 4 international organizations with mandates in Latin America that include higher education, and also one of the biggest networks of over 1,000 universities, all of whom cooperate so as to pursue our shared goal, which is promoting development and inclusion in higher education in the region. We have the IDB, IUE, the Center Universidad, and the IESALC, and the International Institute for UNESCO for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, IESALC. So I'm Victoria Lamoros. I'll have the pleasure of being the animator today, and I work with UNESCO IESALC. And in this meeting, in the next hour and a quarter, we'll start it a bit earlier because we need to catch up with some of the time we've lost during the day. We'll be briefly presenting the results of the consultation we've had in the last month, and then we'll have a panel. And we should be able to present this as they deserve. To give you a bit of background on all of this, these 5 organizations started this process in November 2021, consultations in Latin America and the Caribbean, because the idea was to go over all of this diversity of voices, both inside and outside higher education. And we wanted to bring to this space that diversity and the different ideas that are circulating around the challenges, these 10 subjects of this conference, but are they being concretely applied in Latin America and the Caribbean? This is one of the many consultations which has taken place. And we knew that at the end of the day, because of the time and the resources, that this would be somewhat limited, but we would invite any of you to make consultations of this type. Many people did. We facilitated some guides, and then we have this invitation, and we were present in all these different places. So we're very pleased that all these different organizations, some of which work before us or in parallel with us or after, for instance, University of Cordoba, which will be having a conference for public universities in Latin America, I think in June, and they also kindly invited us, and we'll be there as well. So we're very pleased that all these organizations are undertaking these consultations, which are getting ever bigger and ever more representative, because everything is important, everything is complementary, and we're very thankful for all of this. Let me then go on commenting a bit on the goal here. I've said already earlier in general terms that we want to hear voices from government, from employers, from society, and then within higher education, rectors, presidents of university associations, student groups, teachers' unions. And this was our idea at the end of the day, not to arrive at a specific conclusion or declaration, but rather to capture this diversity to the greatest extent possible. So how did we do this? Well, we did different things, different activities. On the one hand, we went to conferences, regional conferences for higher education. You know this in your region called CRES, which happened in last year's. And we've been trying to say, okay, what was said at all of this? Because what we like is to think about all of this, but also to avoid dealing with the same subjects the same way. Some things have to be dealt with in different ways. So here we had a publication which summarizes the different trends of things that were talked about in each of these different subjects in the previous CRES meetings. We had 10 webinars as well. Some of you already told me that you'd been to some of these. One on each of the 10 subjects. We have 10 experts, also one per subject. We have 40 different representatives for all these different groups that I mentioned. We have almost 3,000 participants in total here. And with all of this, we have one single document which summarizes those 10 webinars. What other things we did? We asked that each of these experts wrote papers on these different subjects. And what did we do with that? Well, we took each of these papers and we made it a chapter of an overall publication which is going to be available starting tonight or tomorrow. We have a rather heavy workload, but as soon as possible in any case. And we also had a public consultation, and this was basically what we'd been announcing in each of the webinars and on the social media. It was sort of an open door we had in our web for anyone who wanted to give us their opinion on challenges or opportunities in each of these subjects. And at the end of the day, we had 900 answers, and we were very grateful to all of the people who decided to come onto our website page and give us their opinions. And all of this has been codified and dealt with. There are some figures as well, and all of this is going to be brought together in a publication. So at the end of the day, there'll be 4 different publications. I have 10 minutes, and I think I've already eaten 3 of these, so now let me give the floor to my colleague Blanca so that she can give you just a few notes or sentences from each of these 4 publications in summary form. It's complicated. You can't obviously summarize all of this in 2 minutes, but it could be a good point of departure so you at least have an idea of what we're talking about. So my colleague will now be commenting on those aspects and the results. I can also tell you that there's a lot of information on the screen. We're not going to be able to cover everything. After the presentation, we'll make this available to everyone so that you may each have it if you wish. Thank you. Many thanks, Victoria. Well, Victoria was saying, starting with the beginning of this process, what we've been doing is presenting these results in the 10 subject areas that were analyzed. The first has to do with the impact of COVID, and as such, it's the only subject which, for obvious reasons, does not have a predecessor. In webinars and in consultations, we saw the quick transition that there was toward digital education, and obviously its negative effects which it had for learning, given the lack of digital skills and abilities, and also limited access and not very inclusive access to technology. This also, we had to recognize the work that was done by teachers, instructors, so as to have continuity in educational activity. And in this way, post-COVID, education needs to go on being centered on students, training teachers, and increasing digitalization strategies. Another subject area analyzed was higher education. In other contexts here, we see that there is interest which has increased greatly in the region, in particular in regional conferences. Before we started talking about SDGs, SDGs were already being discussed a bit, but now we have this much greater focus on the environment and understanding of higher education as a public good. And then after the consultation that we had, what we see is that the main challenge recognized is a lack of link between education and SDGs, particularly because of the lack of flexibility and curricula which exist in the region. And for this region, experts and participants in the consultation referred to a need to consider the goals as a cross-cutting element of higher education in all of its different missions. The third subject has to do with inclusion in higher education, and a recurrent idea we saw with this idea of inclusion, both in regional conferences and in our consultations, was the consideration of higher education as a universal right. In concrete terms, they brought out the need to have inclusive funding mechanisms for people who are handicapped, for minority groups, and dealing both with entrance into and successful completion of studies. And especially a successful completion of studies was mentioned over and over again. Inclusion isn't simply about being able to get into university, but to be able to stay there and to finish their courses of study. Another subject was quality and relevance of programs. Both regional conferences and our consultation showed concern with quality of higher education in the region, and this includes a lack of shared criteria which allows us to encourage and develop the abilities of graduates. We talk about quality for whom and quality for what. It was defined as a necessity to have lifelong learning, horizontal measures, the link with sectors, an increase in funding, and flexibility of curricula. In terms of academic mobility in higher education, both in regional conferences and in our consultation, it was indicated that academic mobility once again requires greater flexibility in curricula and to have greater ease in recognizing degrees between different countries in the region. Mobility for those consultants to generate opportunities so as to encourage the development of abilities and skills among graduates. Participants agree that it is necessary to bring about specific funds for mobility. Another subject area was governance in higher education. Within our regional conferences, we talked about the importance of universities' autonomy. Much emphasis was placed on the idea that this autonomy needs to be supported with accountability and regulation of private education in a complementary way, as we saw in our complementation with IESALC over the last months. We see that within governance of higher education in the region, we need greater articulation between sectors, developing relevant strategies, and an exchange of good practices between countries. On funding of higher education, in CRES, emphasis was placed on the role of governments of the region so as to guarantee funding of higher education. And within the consultation, we saw that there was continuous mention made of the importance of governments, but also the need to generate new strategies and mechanisms that would improve management and evaluation of higher education, but which would also diversify sources of funding, both for educational institutions and for students. And then in terms of producing data and knowledge, within the regional conferences, there was already recognition of the importance of this production of data and of knowledge and adding to the ability of making decisions on the basis of these in higher education. However, in the consultation, and as a result, obviously, of the opportunities we've had with use of technology, collection of data has become simpler, and in this way, anticipations are ever greater. And however, as progress being made is considered a challenge for the region still. Now, on terms of international cooperation to improve synergies, the region is asking for building a space for higher education, which would allow us to institutionalize, diversify, and increase cooperation between countries, and in particular between South and South. This is going to be a long path, which is going to require the participation of many different players and will continue to appear as a challenge. The last subject area has to do with the future of higher education, and this was the subject that had the greatest degree of participation within our consultations, and the participants consider that the future education needs to be flexible in terms of its curriculum, inclusive, connected to society, and digitalized. And for this reason, it will be necessary to implement new organizational practices, to be more international, and to have greater links between different areas. And as Victoria already said, our publications will be available on the IESALC. You can see the UNESCO website and visit at the address that you see here, and you'll be able to be much more intimately familiar with these results by so doing. Many thanks. Well, as you see, we want to give you quite a lot of information in very little time, and these are really just a few little brush strokes that we can show you here, but I hope it will give you some input for the panel that we're going to have. Let me now have our panelists come up here. I'd ask you not to leave me all alone up here on the stage. Please step up here with me. No, there's no protocol. No one told me about anything like a seating plan. Please sit wherever you like.
El protocolo es la caballerosidad de los que les están dejando pasar.
Well, normally, gentlemen should let ladies choose the seats that they would like first. I can't think of any other etiquette that guides us here. Excellent. Very, very good. So, welcome. I'm not going to read all of your biographies because that's going to take quite a lot of time. I'll just present you one by one as the questions are asked. Is that okay? Fantastic. Right. So, for the time being, you'll be anonymous, but everyone knows who you are. If anyone doesn't know who someone is, you see the photos and the people's qualifications up on the screen. So let's get started. Ana Capilla, who is Director of Higher Education and Science at the UAE. And Anna has a lot of experience in the educational sector. In addition to this responsibility, she's a university instructor and has worked in different areas for the Education Authority of Madrid and the Ministry of Education, Culture and Sports in Spain. Welcome, Anna. Thank you. And then, please excuse me, I'm going to have to do a couple of short things. You'll understand that these people have very long curriculums, and we won't be able to read these out in extenso. But I'd like to deal with this diversity of subjects. I think perhaps we could do what we did before, and instead of focusing in on 2 or 3 subjects in more depth, we can look at different things. Right. I think I'll sit down here with you, perhaps. Excuse me. Yes, that would be better. Much better. Right. So on all the different subjects that OIE has been working on in the last decades, there was one was been academic mobility in Ibero-America, and in the present context of change, let's look forward toward 2030, prospective exercise. How do you visualize this mobility in 2030, and what would we have to start changing now so as to be able to get where we want to get in 2030? Many thanks. Well, in 2030, you'll remember that, yeah, we are going to talk about this. That's on the program, right. Well, as you know, the point of departure here is, we can, I think, have hope that we are going to be able to improve mobility, even if we can look at what IESALC is indicating to us about mobility growing very little in the last decade or so. It went to 0.9% to 1.14% in the reference years. And if we look at the world average, that's a really very small increase. And in the same dates, we went from 2.05% mobility to 2.3%. And it was a period of full expansion. I think you'll remember we experienced this in our universities, which were filling up with students from all over the world and the region. I think we go on seeing quite a lot of barriers or obstacles. So so I think this wasn't necessarily managed with different mobility programs at the relevant time. When we looked at the period over certain years with our 2030 strategy for universities, and we saw a bit where the problem resided and wanted to be able to do away with some of the obstacles we were dealing with. We presented our diagnostic report 2022 this morning, and here the issue is to see whether we go on having difficulties with mobilities, in spite of the fact that considerable efforts are being made, we still see these barriers. So in OIE, with the experience we've had with managing problems of mobility, we know that one of the great difficulties that we have is precisely recognition of diplomas of studies, and we need to share the same concepts on this recognition. And it's clear that those students who can, and there aren't many of them, as we said, will not have mobility if they're going to lose semesters or whole school years. That's clear. So to get down to the root of the problem, if you will, and to try to bring about solutions, there have been lots of frustrations over the last years, because when I talk about students, people go to universities in the region, we know this is one of the subjects that constantly comes up. How is it possible that there is so little mobility? Our systems are so different. Basically, we are dealing with 2 different languages and all the rest of it. So we then put together a series of experts and tried to see how we realized we needed something innovative. And they came up with an idea that at the end of the day is based on the idea of identifying subjects, which we can deal with in the same way on a shared platform offered by each university. So these different subjects can be studied by students from different countries. They won't have CCTS or shared credit systems, but we will see that what the content of the subject is, what type of evaluation there was, how much time it lasted. And so the professors are not there to validate, but to guarantee that before a student goes, this course of study will be recognized in another university. And so this is something I'm telling you quite quickly, because I've said this is months and months of work that I'm trying to sum up. But we have experts, some of whom are here with us, but we'll say, okay, let's talk about this. But making all sorts of different proposals, putting different ideas on the table. And if you like, the idea here basically is to have this platform, which we liked because it has a lot to do with the issues that we've been working on, digital transformation in particular. And when we use this platform, we don't simply make it easier, and we saw this especially with the pandemic, with the diagnostic forms, that we couldn't manage any other way, certainly not mobility. And so this made things much easier, all the different formalities that had to be gone through. Once we had this computerized tool that had been on the drawing board and needed to be developed, and this helped us in the end. Technical experts were able to internationalize greater the team, but people went kind of crazy trying to understand what agreement existed between what university and what other university, and this platform meant that a whole file, the whole relationship with another university could be dealt with on this platform, and we all were trying to act in the same way to see what our student was going to do, what type of training they were going to have, because what's quite clear is that every time we're constantly moving toward more flexible types of training and education, and I don't think we could simply stick to bachelor's and master's. I think that we're trying, as I've said, to propose solutions along these lines, and I hope that for 2030 we will have more mobility. And I hope I covered the essential. Now we have all these virtual issues as well, which exploded during the pandemic, and which we're going to have to face in the future. We talked this morning as well about this diagnosis, and I think there is a risk that virtual mobility will not necessarily have the effect. When we look at the tiny percentage of mobility that we're talking about, that with this gap that we've been seeing, the people who want to be mobile will not be limited only to the better off people, that we will be hopefully not just proposing physical mobility for some and virtual mobility for others. The idea is that everybody should have international access, because that's what we need in a globalized world such as ours.
Muchísimas gracias, Ana. Me quedo.
Thank you very much, Anna. So I'll keep this idea about inclusive mobility that is both physical and hybrid and based on technology. So a lot of solutions will be supported by technology. I mean, it's interesting that something that's so interesting from everybody's perspective, such a good thing, mobility, there's nobody who's against mobility, is so complicated. I'm sure things will be much better by 2030, nevertheless. Thank you, Anna. Frances, good afternoon. I haven't seen you around. No, never seen you before. Okay, jokes aside. In case anybody hasn't met him, Dr. Frances Pedro is the director of the UNESCO Center for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, and he has a lot of experience in higher education. He's a professor at the Department of Political Science at Pompeu Fabra University. His work focuses on the development of programs for the transformation of higher education. We're talking about UNESCO and transformation. The core of UNESCO's work is what it is, and we are aware of the fact that universities can have a huge potential role, at least, in relation to SDGs. And apparently universities are starting to become more aware of that potential. How is the role and the impact of universities changing in terms of sustainable development by 2030? And what opportunities have we so far failed to take up? Well, there's a number of them. I can't tell you how things will have changed by 2030, because I don't have a magic ball. But what we do have, I do have some ideas and some points. There are a couple of things I want to say first, though. As Victoria pointed out, I'm here representing UNESCO. So I would like to thank you, all of you, and all of the organizations you represent for sharing this effort with us. And of course, what we're doing now doesn't end today. I mean, it's just a drive to keep our channels of communication open so that we can really continue to promote higher education in Latin America and the Caribbean. And my second point, and I'm sorry to say this, Anna, is this. I've just heard that the Republic of Uruguay is just about to complete ratification of the Regional Convention for Mutual Recognition of Degrees. So perhaps in a matter of hours, well, definitely hours, but perhaps many of them, let's say in a matter of a few days, we will once and for all be able to set forth on the path of a functioning regional convention. And then we can start our work as the secretariat for that convention in the hopes that we can put everything into place so that the issues raised by Anna will become a thing of the past. So hopefully in a matter of hours, please let me put it this way, because that way I have to show my optimism, we could have that very, very good news actually coming into effect. So, in answer to your questions, I would say that the environment in universities in the region is such that the SDGs and the commitment to sustainability are quite on track for becoming a part of daily work at universities. Some figures from the last report from the International Association of Universities on the position of Latin American universities on this matter tell us that more than 80% of universities queried do refer to a commitment to sustainability in their, let's call them, strategic plans. So the SDGs are part of the language, they're part of the discourse, and so that's a fertile ground, but obviously that's not enough. Just talking about things doesn't make us sustainable. Talking about sustainability doesn't make us sustainable. So, three possibilities, three opportunities. For one thing, we're in the middle of a digital transformation process We don't know whether it's going to continue with the same kind of verve or whether it will slow down now that we're back in the classroom. But we're going to try to ensure, first of all, that our commitment to technology is sustainable. That means we have to be careful about energy sources used, and we even have to be careful about how we recycle the materials that we're using. I raise this point because I'm keenly aware of the fact that many universities would like to do more about all this, but transforming archaic structures into sustainable campus structures requires a significant investment, a significant outlay, which universities don't necessarily see as particularly feasible or practical right now. Obviously, at some point, this will have to be done, but the current context is not really suited to huge outlays. Certain universities are undertaking certain types of change that don't entail a lot of cost and yet change attitudes. For instance, things such as simple as how they manage water or electricity use through notices and signs reminding people of things. Students are also driving this change in attitude, which is driving change in behavior. Second point, many universities have started to devise their own specific programs to enshrine their commitment to sustainability in teaching, in research, and in their link to their environment or their setting. This is really important. There's one example that I heard about recently. The University of Panama is able to accredit the way in which its research activities and new teaching programs are linked to the SDGs, to specific SDGs. Another example, an older one. You might recall that one of the last Latin American higher education gatherings prior to the pandemic was the University 2020 meeting in Cuba. You had a lot of universities which, in a country like Cuba, don't have the resources other universities have, for sure, because of the embargo, and yet they were able to show what they were doing about 17 SDGs. So this shows that universities really feel called upon to show that they're contributing to the SDGs. But there are two things that still need fleshing out. One, mentioned by Victoria and Alep in the presentation. How the commitment to sustainability needs to be expressed in the curriculum. In other words, in any curricular content, it should be able to experience the commitment of the university to the SDGs or to sustainability at large. So, for instance, in terms of objectives, in the United States, there's quite a tendency for economics textbooks or course materials not to start with the distinction between supply and demand, classically, the classic distinction, but actually to start with inequalities. I mean, the content may be whatever it might be ultimately, but by doing this sort of thing, the curriculum is coming to address the expectations of young people who are committed to combating inequality and who understand that universities are able to tell them, to teach them about the causes and perhaps find solutions thereby. We and the team led by Yuma, who's back there, set up a boot camp with the idea, working together with other institutions in the rest of the world, with the idea of helping teachers of many different disciplines to emerge from the boot camp with a renovated syllabus in which the commitment to sustainability is present. There are new contents or new skills are built or new approaches. Lastly, another area where there's plenty of room for institutions such as ours to make progress is this. We need reference frameworks on a regional scale for Latin America as regards certification of commitment to sustainability. There should be something like a seal, a stamp. I know some of the organizations represented here have seals and stamps and whatever. So if we had some kind of reference framework that would enable us to do self-certification, which is something that only makes sense on a peer-to-peer basis, well, that could help. So I hope that's a fairly clear reply, I hope. Well, that was extremely clear, Francesc. Thank you very much. I'll keep the idea of going from official and documented strategies on paper, where nobody disagrees with the SDGs, it would appear, to making them more real, fleshing them out, implementing them, and also allocating financial resources, which is still a challenge, although financial resources are scarce. Good evening, or good afternoon, Elena. Elena Arias Ortiz is a senior economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. She's also been a consultant for the World Bank and the UNDP and the European Commission. She works on skill building and transition of students to higher education and to work, as well as the use of digital tools to improve or enhance learning. She has a lot of publications and a lot of articles published in peer-reviewed journals. So let's see, there are two potential questions here. Let's talk about funding and investment, okay? Funding is certainly an issue for us. In such an uncertain context as we're dealing with, and with new emerging needs and older needs that have increased, could we have a certain perspective on what the dynamics of investment in education will be by 2030, and what do we need to be doing now in order to get to that point by 2030? Thank you. Hey, nobody told you this was going to be an easy task. You're right. First of all, I'd like to thank UNESCO, not just for convening this panel, but for inviting us here to listen. It's been really interesting to take part in this event. Thank you very much for this opportunity, for real. On funding, Francesc and I just spent more than an hour talking about funding, and we didn't manage to cover everything, so obviously I won't be able to cover everything in such a short speech. But one thing I can say about the bank and the countries is that there's a real issue with equality, and funding needs to really help with that. We've improved on inclusion of less privileged social groups, but there remains a lot to be done. On top of this, we have the pandemic. The pandemic has had quite an impact on equality. The more vulnerable students found it harder to access electronic equipment and were more likely to be left out of both secondary and higher education. And government budgets are more likely to shrink than to grow. So that makes things even more of a challenge. Against this backdrop, the question is, how can we make this investment smarter, more effective, but above all, with greater equality? How can we make it provide greater equality? So we have to face what barriers students face in terms of accessing higher education. our bank has assessed and analyzed them. There are financial barriers, but also academic barriers and barriers of information and context. And most students from vulnerable backgrounds actually have all three types compounded. So in a setting of shrinking government budgets, we need to look at demand funding instruments. We need to really focus on less privileged students, for instance, by providing scholarships. Scholarships are provided for a very small percentage of students finishing secondary schooling, and on top of that, they don't consider the limitations faced by students during their studies. There are some scholarships in Peru for the students from vulnerable backgrounds. There are some scholarships in Chile for indigenous peoples. So you really need to contextualize the exact right kind of support and scholarships. There's also a matter of student credits. Student loans. Government-regulated student loans with reasonable interest rates that are contingent on graduating could contribute in the present circumstances to provide greater access. And in addition to this, these loans need to make it possible for students to explore possibilities on top of that. Scholarships have to go hand in hand with quality assurance methods that will encourage universities and students universities who have students receiving this sort of funding to really make sure that this is effective, that the students will be able to make something of their education there. And I'd also like to mention the other barriers. Some of these policies are not that expensive, but there's concern about how effective they might be. For instance, there's a need for courses to help students bridge the gap between secondary schooling and universities. Most 16-year-olds graduate with very low achievement levels, and especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds. So they need support not only to access higher education, but also throughout higher education in order to have more equal standard. And then students who are the first in their family or in their setting to gain access to higher education lack a lot of information or awareness of career options that they may never have heard of. So we need to work more with secondary schools in order to provide guidance and counseling from a very early age even. It's not just for the more vulnerable groups, it's also for minorities, for women. In terms of women, you really have to start tackling the issue in early childhood education, really, so that women will be led on a more likely basis to STEM options. So it's not just about direct financial support, but also other things that will encourage students to join and then stay. Thank you, Elena. So my take home is these are difficult times in terms of budgetary restrictions, so we need to be imaginative and find ways to fund scholarships, certainly, but also not ignore the possibility of loans and other options. So loans could help complement scholarships, and we have to consider what their impact is, and of course we can't forget other mechanisms such as bridging and so forth. Thank you very much. So let's keep going. Mr. Arturo Cherbowski, good afternoon. Why am I calling you Dr. Arturo Cherbowski? I don't know. It just came out that way. Mr. Arturo Cherbowski, Professor Arturo Cherbowski, whatever. Arturo Cherbowski is the Executive Director of Santander Universidades and the Director General of the University in Mexico. Within his institution, he is responsible for promoting development of support for universities, for support for entrepreneurship, the good spreading of good practice and digitization. And there are also the professorships and scholarships and financial services to the university community. Welcome. Here we would like to talk about something that Santander is doing, from the private sector, and as an employer, you have very varied kinds of relations with universities. So we'd like to hear about collaboration and collaborative innovation, and about how universities are increasingly open to linking up with different actors, players in their environment. To what extent will have university collaboration with businesses, with governments, and with society at large by 2030? And how should universities align now to make this vision possible? Thank you very much. Mrs. Victoria, I have to say. Okay, so thank you very much, Francesc. Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you very much to my fellow panelists. Thank you very much to the members of the audience. Many of them have been fighting the good fight with me for many years. Now, we have to address this not only from the perspective of universities, but from the perspective of the universities and the many other players that want to cooperate with universities. In fact, it's the universities that, in many cases, are in an ivory tower, but that's not always the case. I mean, this discourse, which we sometimes hear from business leaders saying that universities are slow and sluggish and unwilling to collaborate, well, it's often just quite inaccurate. So we really need to open up to one another, and we need to start aligning on common objectives. I do feel that collaboration needs to grow in our region, and we do all need to work together, breaking down barriers, breaking down the kinds of resistance that Elena mentioned. I mean, it is a fact that government budgets are shrinking. You were very careful to say, at least in the immediate context. I mean, it's definitely a trend, and it's a trend that's been around for a long time. It looks as though there really isn't enough money to go around, at least for strictly public funding of universities. And that's not going to change in the short term, let's put it that way. So we have to start considering how to offset the lack of resources. Universities are much more serious about knowledge transfer processes that will give rise to alternative sources of funding. This is not usual in our region, but many public universities in other parts of the world have been working this way with excellent results. We have to stop thinking that applied science is bastardized science and that it's selling out to private interests. Many public universities all over the world have been generating own resources which they're able to invest back in the university community and in for their students, thanks to this kind of approach. They've been extremely effective. So we have to start realizing that it's wrong to think of this as philanthropy. No, it's not about philanthropy. It's about building alliances that are a win-win for all those involved. But we do need to structure things, and other panels have mentioned this as well. Both universities and those of us who seek to partner with them should pursue quality. That's already been mentioned, of course. It goes without saying. But should also remember the social approach that we need in society. We need collaborative projects where the private sector can be involved, and there's good reason for the private sector to be on board, but the purpose must have to do with addressing social challenges in the setting of the university. This has often been an issue, a failure to identify the social good, the social purpose. So it's not just about raising money for the university, and it's not just about making money for the private sector. This logic prevails both in universities and in the private sector. We need to change that. If there's no measurable social impact, then it's probably not the right kind of project for the kind of virtuous collaboration that we seek and that can find alternative ways of funding things. I mean, since we know that government budgets are not going to be increasing over the next, say, at least 10 years. And that is, of course, without forgetting that higher education is a public good, it's a higher good. Thank you very much, Arturo. So my take-home is that we need to break down resistance and barriers, and that they exist everywhere, in all sectors. So collaboration in the present times is not about whether we do it, it's about how we do it, because we really need to, together, tackle the social issues and problems that we have. Thank you. Finally, we have Felix Garcia Lausin. He's the coordinator of the Ibero-American Space for Knowledge, SEGIB, and he's also taught at universities. He's been the Secretary General of the Conference of Rectors of Spanish Universities. He's been an advisor to the Spanish presidency in 2004. Welcome, Felix. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Muchas gracias.
Many thanks, Victoria. Good afternoon to everyone. I would obviously like to begin by thanking IESALC UNESCO for this experience that we've all had together with many, many other activities we've shared, spaces of all kinds. Thanks to Victoria, thanks to the whole team. Right. When you're the last speaker, there are advantages and disadvantages. Let's start with the advantages. I have a question. Why? Because what interests me above all is to know, with this great experience that we've had with intergovernmental cooperation for more than 20 years, and we've done this in the Inter-American summits that have been organized, and there have been a whole series of subjects, including education, including higher education, the area which you and Felix work in. And I'd like to know a bit more about this cooperation. When we look toward the future, toward 2030, how do you consider this cooperation in higher education, including, of course, research in the region is going to be, and how should we start acting now in order to get where we want to go? Perfect. Well, I said I was going to start with being the advantages of being the last panelist. So then, of course, I will have to come to grips with your question. But I think there are certain spaces which we can illuminate in order to go forward toward what we want cooperation to be in higher education in 2030. And I will refer to that. I also have in mind the round table where I was this morning when people said, well, the future is now. It's not 2030, it's today. We need to think about what we're doing today. So I think that there are huge efforts being made, very distinguished cooperation happening in higher education, which is giving an impetus to institutions themselves or working with governments or other entities like we see with the Santander and FIT. But I think we need to concentrate our efforts a bit more at the structural level. For instance, regional agreement, when we heard about this with Frances, and then in Uruguay with Carlos, I think this is a job that we all have to do to make progress structurally. And I'd like to draw your attention to this. To me, this is a bit like investing in big infrastructures, communication, transport. They've been able to have vehicles and roads and highways even, and that's what we're going to be working on in coming years and trying to see how we, in the Ibero-American context, where we have been making progress with spaces for consultation, as we already heard this morning. I wanted to start with that, by the way, to talk about the importance of making progress, structurally speaking. We have academic and political consultation spaces which allow us to align our efforts and the direction in which we're looking forward, what's being done by government, and I think this has been very profitable. It's a curious thing because there's this whole idea of needing to make structural progress and create instruments and mechanisms and take advantage of spaces for cooperation. And we've seen this with ministers and other high authorities, councils, in the Ibero-American era as well, in Latin America and the Caribbean. There are also these spaces. And above and beyond that, to be aware of the fact that we have had insufficient funding. And we need to take advantage of that. And let me come back again to the case of the European Union. And I think here we just have to stay, and it seems to me at least very interesting, to have the European Union reacting to this consultation on the basis of funding, that should be the operative idea, that this is a resource and that this is going to get institutions moving, and on that basis, things will happen. We have developed a great capacity for consultation. I think we're well ahead of the European Union here. At least I see that. It's relatively easy to arrive at these agreements, no greater depth in them. We might come up with other problems along the way, but it seems to me that what I'm saying to you here is when we look at financial availability in our region, what's possible on that level, this is the thing we need to change, this way of thinking. Efforts need to be made to see how more funding can be given to higher education in our region. It's an investment, it's an expenditure, we keep saying. But we see that what predominates in the planet today, how things are happening, we have people who want to develop countries on the one hand, and then there are those who invest in knowledge and technology, and you see very directly what happens. Sometimes you don't have the feeling, I don't want to say that you're resigned, but I think it's like when you're in the emergency room, you're thinking about 2030, but we're having an emergency right now. I think we need to get out of this way of thinking and come to grips with funding. And I think I'll conclude on that part, Victoria. And so I know I was a bit emphatic about this. Academic mobility is important too, because when we look at this, well, when we have proper instruments for funding that will allow us to have real equity and participation in academic mobility, I think sincerely that universities are very capable of solving these problems among themselves in terms of recognizing degrees, periods of study, and that when there isn't too much interference from bureaucracy, students end up overcoming this themselves. They'll have a European experience, if you will, here. And I think that this is a responsibility of governments in higher education and to make resources available for this cooperation to be more fluid. Thank you very much. So I'm going to stick with this call for necessary structural changes to make spaces for political change and other forms of change. It's a long path, a complicated path we have before us. We all know it, but it's also necessary so that necessary expenditures be made in higher education and for these to be seen as investment. And so I've just gotten a note that we are running short of time. And so we have a second round of questions for you, so that you can't have any excuse not to answer the questions. We ran out of time, but I'd like to be very respectful of our time that's been set for us, for our interpreters, the people who are working here in general, and of course to give you the possibility in the audience to ask some questions as well. So I will look at hands being raised. I'm very sorry, I'm not seeing very well, but the microphone is being passed around. I think the young lady there is offering a microphone. Many thanks. Just one moment, excuse me. I need to say that for reasons of time and because I've seen a lot of hands raised and to be respectful of others, we can take as many questions as possible. So let me ask all of you, first of all, to introduce yourselves when you start, and then perhaps not to go on at great length, to be very concrete in your questions. Yes, here there's a series of representatives of many different institutions, sociopolitical ones from the continent. I am a professor at the University of Mérida, Venezuela, and you don't know how hard it was for me to get here. IESALC, when you go and have a look at the webpage, you see something like the future is university education for all. For everyone, the whole society, not just students who are finishing primary and secondary school, but that we're going to learn starting in 72 with referring to the whole society being in a permanent state of education. So education is ongoing, and so society has to be an educative society. Now, what does that mean? If you look at the challenges of the 21st century, how are we going to bring together all our educational structures to make them able to deal with sustainable development? When we talk about 16 for PACE and 17 for alliances between institutions, how are we going to make all of the structural changes, the cooperative projects, the efforts to earmark investment for higher education and for social development? And so here we're not just talking about investment, because there will never be too much money for higher education because there's too much competition between all these different needs. So to wind up, sustainable societies fighting inequality. This is one of the great missions we have. But this is, when you look at poverty, for instance, as a whole layer of society, you can't just have indicators for poverty. You look at the indicators for goals 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and inclusiveness, gender issues, men and women, equity and equality. All of this is very difficult. And all of this has to be done to fight poverty. And the most difficult thing of all is to reduce inequalities, because this is where we will have confrontation between social institutions that need to work together on sustainable development and programs for 2022, because we're dealing with an emergency. And we are then going to say, okay, we've got 40 or 50 years that have gone by since the historical conferences, but the future is now, and global warming is here. And all of this in general, it seems to me that, I know I'm being very Venezuelan here, but I'm part of the world when I talk about the climate. ARIUS, the Alliance of University Networks for Sustainable Development in the Environment. ARIUS in Latin America and Caribbean together, this is a big area. You've got sub-regional things happening in Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, different indigenous groups that are there, and we can already have efforts made in the northern part of South America, in the north of Venezuela, but also Central America and Mexico. Brazil is another continent. We have all of these sub-regions, and we're going to have to coordinate. Thank you very much. Thanks very much. We'll take a couple more questions, and then we will, to the extent possible, have answers. Thanks. I'll be speaking English because my Spanish isn't very good.
I would like to just comment on the fact that, when I came to this panel, I really wanted to hear about the next decade, the future of higher education in Latin America and the Caribbean. But again, I feel that the sea is very superficial. The Caribbean has not been addressed. I am not sure that the Caribbean is considered in its diversity. I want to address this issue because, of course, I know that you're putting much effort, collaborators that I know, that I respect, and in fact, Felix, Frances, and the Caribbean should be more represented in this kind of panel, in its diversity. Not only the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, but the Caribbean as such. And you have French-speaking, Dutch-speaking, English-speaking, and you also have European regions of the Caribbean, ultra-peripheral regions of the Caribbean. So I believe that if we talk about the future, and if we talk about collaboration, SDG 17 is about collaboration South-South, North-South, but making it more global and inclusive. And I really wish that the diversity of the Caribbean region would be more embraced in those kind of panels. I just want to finish by saying that in terms of shifting the power dynamics, decolonizing higher education, this is also part of it, because the discrepancies that we have here, the gaps, are only colonial inherited gaps because of language barriers. It's only because of the language that you mentioned, mostly Spanish-speaking Caribbean and Latin America. But we have to move beyond this colonial heritage, and decolonizing higher education should be part of the next decade. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for your comment and bringing.
Oh, yeah, sorry. My name is Miriam Moyes. My name is Miriam Moyes, Vice President for International.
So the interpreters apologize, but it is time for us to go. There will be no more interpretation as of this point.
Of Universities Caribbean, which is the organization of Caribbean universities and research institutes, about 30 members. Thank you very much.
Miriam, thank you very, very much. Merci beaucoup.
Gracias, buenas tardes. Muy breve. Yo aspiro para la próxima década que, además de los distinguidos y excelentes panelistas, también sumemos esfuerzos con las redes y consejos universitarios, los gremios, etcétera, porque IESALC, UNESCO ha trabajado por un lado y las redes por otro. Y no vamos a decir que no es un problema de culpa, ¿no? Es aspiración que juntos trabajemos diferentes de futuro, porque no podemos decir inclusión, igual que decía ella, que yo estoy totalmente de acuerdo, hablar de inclusión siendo excluyentes. Yo creo que aquí se ha trabajado al margen de las instancias, que nos gusten o no son las instancias. Si a alguien le duele la cabeza, no se corta la cabeza, sino que busca cómo resolver el problema, porque la cabeza es importante. El sistema financiero, el sector privado, los académicos, los gremios, las instituciones, para una educación al servicio de los pueblos, no de los organismos internacionales. Y una UNESCO que trabaje con la región, no al margen de la región y haciendo aspectos paralelos. Eso yo quería plantear como una aspiración. Yo digo acá, nosotros todos debemos trabajar juntos, no es versus, sino es juntos, con inclusión en la práctica, incluyendo, por supuesto, con derecho pleno y participación plena en el Caribe y el multilingüismo, el multiculturalismo, etc.
Muchas gracias. Y me temo, estamos ya fuera de tiempo. De hecho, me han dicho que ya incluso ni siquiera hay interpretación, lo que también me disculpan por los tiempos. Vamos a tomar una última pregunta y después una ronda muy rápido para ver si entre todos podemos ir tocando algunos de los comentarios y preguntas que se han hecho. La última pregunta por aquí, por favor, gracias.
Muchas gracias. Soy Alma Maldonado, investigadora del Departamento de Investigaciones Educativas del CINVESTAP, un centro público en México. Yo quiero un poco referirme a, y quisiera pedirles, obviamente ya no hay mucho tiempo, también a la discusión sobre el tema del contexto político, ¿no? A mí me parece que de pronto hablamos de América Latina como una gran aspiración de unidad, incluyente, etcétera. Pero América Latina, por supuesto, es muy diversa, ya lo mencionó la colega del Caribe, pero también es muy diversa políticamente y hemos transitado por muchos momentos donde hay alianzas y hay distintos contextos que yo creo que también hay que remitir, porque en todos estos procesos que estamos viviendo de cambios, la región no solo compite, sino también colabora. Pero creo que la parte de la competencia es una cosa que también es importante mencionar en este debate sobre América Latina. No solo es una discusión sobre hacia dónde, sino también lo que está sucediendo y cuáles son las consecuencias. Y simplemente menciono que en el caso de México estamos viviendo destrucción de instituciones de educación superior hoy por el contexto político. No me voy a referir a otros países de la región, pero todos ustedes saben que también está ocurriendo. Y todo esto, ¿qué consecuencias va a tener en el futuro? ¿No? Porque justamente en lo que se ha trabajado, de pronto sucede que los contextos ideológicos y políticos están transformando fuertemente la región, y no es solamente hablar en un plano donde no estamos viendo todas estas consecuencias que son muy importantes y que importan en la educación superior. Ya.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Ana, muchas gracias a todos los que han preguntado, sin duda preguntas complejas y temas complejos para los que necesitaríamos. ¿Cuántos días nos podemos quedar en Barcelona? Necesitaríamos mucho más tiempo del que tenemos, así que de manera breve quizá le podría ir pidiendo a cada uno de ustedes que fueran contestando, tomando algunas de las reflexiones que se han hecho y también que pudieran hacer una reflexión final, ¿no? Y ya vamos a ir terminando de esta forma el panel. Pues quizá empezamos por aquí ahora, Félix.
Muy bien, pues muchas gracias. Comenzando casi por el final del contexto político, en fin, yo creo que eso está siempre muy presente, desde luego, en nuestra actuación.
Disculpen.
Sí, es que la persona que ha hecho la pregunta, ¿cómo está ahí? No, respecto de la intervención de la persona que participó del CINVESTAP, lo que decía es que justo en el ámbito de la Secretaría General Iberoamericana y del desempeño mío, esto lo voy a conectar luego con no una respuesta, sino un comentario a Miriam Mois también, ¿no? En el ámbito nuestro, que operamos fundamentalmente con los gobiernos, pues los contextos políticos están siempre más que presentes, y de hecho somos un ámbito, el de la Conferencia Iberoamericana, donde todas las decisiones han de tomarse por consenso, es decir, que si no hay consenso no hay acuerdo, y eso hace que, por supuesto, estemos siempre en la mayor de las sintonías con las sensibilidades y los espacios y los planteamientos más políticos, ¿no? Y luego a Miriam, gracias por la pregunta. La verdad es que, en fin, por tu comentario, porque hay que agradecerlo, ¿no? Porque está absolutamente bien visto, ¿no? Yo, en fin, yo lo único a lo que me podía apegar, y lo voy a decir, es porque, claro, estoy aquí participando como coordinador del Espacio Iberoamericano del Conocimiento, me resulta, a veces es una tontería, porque, en fin, también es responsabilidad mía atender a todo el scope de la reunión, ¿no? Pero te agradezco mucho el comentario porque es verdad, ¿no? Es verdad. Yo creo que hablamos mucho de, bueno, pues también, si me permiten mis colegas y compañeros latinoamericanos, pues hablamos mucho de la región hispanohablante, el usoparlante, y en ocasiones no hablamos todo lo que deberíamos de hablar y estar en la conexión y en la cooperación que deberíamos de estar con los países de la región latinoamericana y caribeña que, pues en tu caso representas, Miriam, y en fin, esto lo reconozco así y te agradezco, como digo, mucho esta pregunta, ¿no? Y gracias, termino al IESALC por la oportunidad de participar en este debate. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Félix. Elena.
Yo quisiera también referirme a la pregunta sobre el Caribe, porque para el banco que tenemos el Interamericano y el Caribe, so I would like to speak in English just to address, because for us it's absolutely a priority, and to work with our Caribbean member countries. I have personally worked, well, not only speaking, I have worked in Suriname. I'm currently working with Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados, supporting digital transformation of universities there through measurement of digital competencies of teachers, mapping resources to train the teachers, and many more. That's the area I work in, but also providing resources. University of West Indies, a strong partner we have, and it is key. Sometimes, I believe, I just wanted, this is not, of course, I'm not justifying anything. Sometimes when we publish data, for example, or statistics, this comes very often. It's true, the Caribbean countries are often not well represented in this graph because we don't find enough data, comparative data in particular, when we try to map this in a regional perspective. But in the other activities, and first we are working to build stronger data. We invested in labor market service, household service too, and they are more and more appearing in our data first. And second, in all the other activities, investment, grants, and technical cooperation, financial cooperation, they are absolutely a priority for us. So, but thank you for bringing the point, because it's always important to remind us that the sea is well there and it's very important for us. So, thank you.
Muchas gracias, Elena. Te doy la palabra, Ana.
Muchas gracias. Yo voy antes he citado a IESALC, pues voy a citar a mi secretario general, que esta mañana decía, bueno, una conferencia como esta, nosotros que hemos presentado, como digo, el informe diagnóstico, ahora estamos presentando este trabajo que hemos realizado con estos socios. Aquí lo que abrimos es un proceso de diálogo. Nosotros lanzamos ideas, lanzamos análisis en el que no han intervenido muchas personas, porque intentamos que sea muy participativo, y además, como digo, nosotros en concreto tenemos un consejo asesor en el que tenemos sabios, Frances Pedro, tenemos a Brunner, tenemos gente que sabe, expertos, pero además combinamos con entrevistas que hacemos, pues incluso a los técnicos que llevan la internacionalización en las universidades. Félix, no sé si estarían muy de acuerdo contigo. Estarían de acuerdo desde luego en que necesitan más financiación, pero necesitan muchas más cosas. Es decir, que nosotros intentamos tener la perspectiva más amplia posible, pero aún así, esto que lanzamos ahora es para seguir hablando. En el caso concreto de la OI, nosotros además lo traducimos en una estrategia, Universidad Iberoamérica 2030, de la cual nosotros a partir de ahí formulamos proyectos de cooperación, porque nosotros realmente no somos un think tank ni un instituto de pensamiento, nosotros somos un organismo de cooperación. Llevamos 70 años en la región y sí que los ministros son nuestros jefes, pero también trabajamos por y para la comunidad educativa, eso lo tenemos muy claro, y por eso digo que participan de nuestros procesos y mucho más luego de los proyectos de cooperación de los que se alimentan todos estos informes que elaboramos y demás, es pensando en ellos. Así que nosotros damos la bienvenida a todos los que quieran hacer comentarios al informe, quieran mandarnos buenas prácticas. Es una cosa que hacemos muy frecuentemente, seminarios donde damos el protagonismo a las instituciones para que presenten sus buenas prácticas y los compartan con otras universidades de la región. Somos una región en la que la cooperación horizontal funciona muy bien, yo creo que es uno de los puntos fuertes, y desde luego por nuestra parte todos son bienvenidos. Desde luego no excluimos ni zonas, ni personas, ni instituciones, ni nada.
Gracias, Ana. Arturo.
Muchas gracias, Victoria. Oye, ahora yo tengo la ventaja que vengo después de Félix, entonces también puedo responder un poco después de que Félix respondió, y una gran ventaja. La ventaja al final la tiene Frances y está muy bien. Quick comment, the point about the Caribbean for me is well taken, and on my side, mea culpa, because we don't work with Caribbean countries of any linguistic Yes, exactly, and so and it's probably something we should look into, definitely, and applies to the work that we could be doing in the Caribbean at large. So point definitely well taken. And I'll go back to the comment, voy a regresar al comentario sobre el contexto político, porque ahí es donde me permite también un poquito comentar al final sobre este tema de los contextos políticos, y entendiendo que el contexto político sí está muy presente, y que Félix lo dijo, y también estando completamente de acuerdo con Félix que el tema estructural es probablemente el tema donde tenemos que estar centrando los esfuerzos, porque son los problemas muchísimo más apremiantes, y dándole toda la razón en que estamos avanzando o hemos avanzado muchísimo en los espacios de concertación, y para llegar a esos acuerdos. Mi temor es que, a pesar de los grandes avances que hemos tenido en estos espacios de concertación no han materializado el financiamiento del compromiso de los gobiernos que se requiere. Entonces, sí tenemos grandes organismos de concertación, sí hay grandes reuniones de ministros, sí se empieza a hablar a pesar de las diferencias políticas, y sin embargo esas grandes necesidades siguen sin estar atendiendo. Y entonces sí corremos el peligro que estos grandes espacios de concertación y estos logros de concertación que sí se han hecho, pues acaben redundando en una sopa de organizaciones internacionales o multinacionales que no logran resolver los problemas apremiantes de la región. Y eso para mí sería mi miedo, porque hasta ahorita pues parece que ese es el track record. Sí, nos juntamos, hablamos, tenemos reuniones como esta, estamos completamente conscientes que se requiere muchísimo más financiamiento. Ese financiamiento no llega, no ha llegado. Y qué bueno que los ministros se comprometan, pero no importa que se comprometan acá, que se comprometan cuando lleguen a sus países a hablar con sus respectivos ministros de Hacienda. Si no, sí tenemos que pensar de otra forma, y yo ahí no le diría resignación, no estoy resignado, pero sí estoy bastante pesimista.
Pues esperamos una versión más optimista para cerrar este panel. Además, Frances es alguien muy optimista por naturaleza, así que te doy la responsabilidad de hacer la última reflexión y confío que sea optimista.
Mi última reflexión va en el sentido de volver al principio, de agradeceros a todos y a todas realmente el apoyo prestado durante este proceso, que yo diría que abre las puertas a procesos más amplios precisamente de consulta, de auscultación de lo que está pasando, porque es la única manera de entender efectivamente cómo podemos cobrar sentido en un panorama complejo, ¿verdad?, como el que tenemos por delante. Además, quisiera destacar igualmente, se han dicho muchas cosas, se ha hecho referencia al Caribe, yo quisiera destacar igualmente que algo que me parece muy importante, y es que estamos en el contexto de una conferencia mundial, ciertamente, pero deben saber que el grupo más numeroso en la agrupación justamente que hace Naciones Unidas de países, que es artificial como todo en esta vida, el grupo más numeroso viene de América Latina y el Caribe. Y esto es gracias no solo al hecho, piensen que en principio eran 33 delegaciones, 4 personas por delegación, estamos cerca de 500 personas de América Latina y el Caribe, y creo que esto es la demostración fehaciente de que de nuestra parte, de la parte que nosotros modestamente hemos podido gestionar, hemos hecho todo lo posible para que instituciones universitarias, redes, creo, las veo aquí bien representadas, estén aquí. Por tanto, creo que las palabras, digamos, se tienen que rendir a los hechos, y los hechos es que esta es una verdadera expresión de nuestra voluntad de colocarnos al servicio de un movimiento que ya está ahí y que afrenta desafíos muy importantes de los cuales no hemos hablado hoy, como por ejemplo la polarización de nuestras sociedades, las crecientes inequidades o los constantes, incesantes ataques a la libertad académica, que cada vez están, por desgracia, más presentes también en nuestra región. En esas batallas nos encontrarán juntos, desde luego que sí. Muchas gracias.
Sin duda, muchísimas gracias, Frances. Pues por mi parte, Solo me queda agradecerles a los panelistas por compartir con todos nosotros las experiencias, las ideas, esas visiones de futuros posibles que pueda tener la educación superior en América Latina y el Caribe, y que aunque todavía no tenemos tan claros, lo que sí tenemos claro es que debemos construir entre todos, porque el 2030 está ahí a la vuelta de la esquina. Algunos dicen que es hoy. Pero sobre todo muchas gracias a las 900 personas que dieron su opinión a través de la consulta pública, a las casi 3.000 personas que participaron en los webinars, a los 10 expertos, los 40 representantes de la Triple Hélice que nos acompañaron, a los que organizaron otras consultas paralelas, a los que las van a organizar. Les animamos a todos ustedes a que lo sigan haciendo, a que sigan organizando foros, y si nos invitan ahí estaremos. Y muchas gracias a todos ustedes por primero venir a Barcelona, después quedarse en la conferencia con el día tan magnífico que hace y esta ciudad tan preciosa, después por decidir venir a esta sesión con la oferta que hay tan buena también ahí fuera, y por la participación y por su interés. Y está claro que en la última hora y media solo hemos dado un paso más de los muchos que ya se han dado y de los muchos que nos quedan, porque bueno, aún no tenemos todas las respuestas, queda mucho trabajo por hacer, pero de nuevo lo que tenemos claro es que lo haremos de la mano, lo haremos todos juntos, porque en la diversidad geográfica, de idiomas, de género, étnica y de opiniones, y en el respeto a todas ellas está la clave para construir al final una región más inclusiva, más conectada y con mayor cohesión, porque solo así al final podremos transformar la educación superior en un verdadero motor de desarrollo social y económico para poder conseguir o estar lo más cerca posible de conseguir los ODS dentro de la región. No les entretengo más, muchísimas gracias, muy buena tarde, que vaya bien Barcelona y hasta pronto.